For our primary painting this weekend, we are going to focus on Matisse and his bird's eye view of apples on a plate on a table. And I want to focus first of all on this tablescape with the still life of the apples. And I just want to take a few moments to talk to you about the bird's eye view perspective and how we are looking down onto the plate. So the bird's eye view means that we are standing over, or an area is going to be lower so that we can see everything that's happening from up above. So we see the three different types of apples on the plate. We see the plate is sitting on a textured towel or cloth. And then we see over to the side another apple. What I also want you to focus on for just a few moments is how the light is also shining on these surfaces. So you can see the light shining on the tops of the apples. You can see, even though this apple is not shiny, it doesn't have the skin that's shiny, you can still see lighter areas of that apple in different colorations. You can also see shadowed areas where the light is not hitting. And then you can see the shadowed areas on the plate. You can see the light shining on the rim of the plate compared to the shadow here on this curve, and so on. And then with the textured cloth, you can see that there is a textured element of pattern. So we're going to focus on this week, and we're going to start by getting our paper ready. So come back with me in just a moment when you have your pencil and paper ready. This is Matisse's Apples from 1916, and I wanted to show this to you for you to kind of get an understanding of where we're starting from and where we're headed. This gives us a good example of the bird's eye view, looking down onto the apples, looking down onto the plate, and then seeing texture around. It also gives us some shadow and highlights, as well as the different colors that we can see in the roundness of the apples. So we're going to use Matisse this week as our inspiration. Sometimes when I am getting started or coming up with an idea for what I would like to do, I look at maybe my favorite artists, or just pieces that inspire me or move me. They make kind of my heart pitter patter or beat a little faster. So what I would suggest, because you're not sitting here with me, we're not all looking at the same grouping of apples unless you watch our video and then go back and look at the still life still that we started with. You might want to get a few apples on a plate and sit them in front of you for this piece. What if you don't have apples? What if you have oranges? Then do oranges. You're not going to have maybe the variety of shapes and colors on your oranges, but you could have a variety of sizes and maybe some value of the orange. There are other pieces of fruit that you could also do. So the very first thing that we're going to do is get ready for our apples. We're going to start with the plate. And remember, we're looking down on our paper. This paper that you've picked up at the public library has been pre-cut for you and pre-taped so that you can have a nice border. And we're just gonna sketch lightly. You might be able to see, I'm not sure on our video, that I've already sketched a little bit. I used a pink eraser, bad idea. I'm having to go back over and trying to erase my pink eraser with a white eraser, but we'll be fine. So I'm going to start with my plate. I'm looking down on the plate, so I'm going to see that whole circle. And if we're thinking about the size of our paper, we're thinking about using our space wisely. And if we're thinking about being able to fit everything on this paper that I've cut for you, then we need to have the majority of our paper with the plate and then a small section over to the side for the apple over. I just thought it would be kind of fun to have an apple off the plate. If you want to do all the apples on the plate like Matisse, then you can do that. And my plate has an edge around it, so once I get my basic circle, I'm going to come back around and add that edging. Now my proportions of the charger that I'm using compared to what I'm drawing is not going to be the same. I'm just getting a basic idea, just using it as a jumping off point for my plate. You can turn your paper around like me, sketching. And what I'm gonna do after I'm finished, I'm just gonna come back and clean up some of those lines. We're looking down on our plate so far. And just getting rid of some of those extra marks. Okay. So now I'm going to put my 3 apples on my plate and then the other apple over to the side. And I'm going to actually, because you can't see from where I am, I'm actually going to pick up my apple and look down on it like you would be looking down this way. I'm going to look down at this one to get the basic shape. And if you do that while you're looking and your line isn't as round as you want it to be, as apples are a rounded organic sphere, then just go back and fix that. And now I'm going to want to work on this middle section. We don't have a lot of details of these apples other than maybe the colorations, the striations that they have. In this middle part where the stem has been broken off. And I'm just giving myself some markings that kind of lend to the three-dimensional aspect of this. I'm going to put that apple back down, and now I'm going to pull the next apple, my Red Delicious, and I'm going to look at the shape of that. I know that it was sitting this part of my plate. So just looking down at it, I'm going to start looking at it and sketching it. I'm putting it back. I'm going to pick up my Granny Smith. And last, I'm going to put my yellow apple over here. Many times when we're drawing circles, we want our circles to be perfect, and a lot of times if I want a perfect circle, then I typically trace it. Well, this is a good lesson in not tracing, because the apples are not a perfect sphere. or circle when you look down. So it's a good lesson in practicing your spacing, making those organic shapes, looking back at my apples and noticing that they shouldn't be all the same size. So working on that just a little bit. Okay, and then we have the background or the undermarking of the textured cloth. And sometimes it's just fun to add some interesting texture to what you're creating. But if you are just wanting to explore the watercolor, then that's not something that you need to even worry about. We're going to start with our apples, and before we start actually painting, let's take a moment to look at our painting supplies for this week. You have received a type of watercolor that's called semi-moist. Semi-moist means that right now it feels dry. It actually is holding in a little moisture. It's just, you can see I was rubbing on the red and it's coming slightly off on my finger. So these are called semi-moist watercolor, and you activate the color by adding water to it. I have that, and that's what I'll be showing you. I also have liquid watercolor. So this liquid watercolor, when I pour it out of my tubes into my palette, it's already in liquid form, and it's a concentrated bright color. You can see I have many more colors than just what comes in an ordinary watercolor palette, and these enable me to get a wider range of colors, and it also enables me to mix colors that I need or want. We are also going to be using a water cup. So you need to ask your loved one for a cup that you can use if you don't have one that's designated as an art cup. You also received probably two, it says NASCO Country School, but these are watercolor brushes. And so a large and a smaller will probably be fine for you. And then some paper towels to wipe as you are changing colors and such. So make sure you have all of your supplies ready, and we will come back in just a moment and get started on our apples. So we have all of our supplies ready, and we are now going to get our brush ready. Our brush is straight from the factory, straight from where we ordered it from. And so I'm just going to dip it into my water, loosen it up a little bit, and you can see it's already moving much better. So I'm going to start with my green apple. It's at the top, and I'm going to start with my yellow. When I look at the green apple, I know that it's not a perfect green that we might see on a leaf or in grass. And so I'm just going to take a moment to paint an undercolor. Remember, watercolor is created with water, so if your brush is getting dry, then you need to re-dip. Okay, now I'm going to come and just get a little bit of green on my brush and come back to create that Granny Smith lime green color. And I'm just going to apply that over the yellow that I started with. So yellow is lightening that grass or leaf green. And turning it into this more bright, vibrant color. I'm going to carefully go around that apple stem area. And just by looking down at my apple, I can see that this is going to be the darker side and this is going to be the brighter area. So I'm just going to come back with more of that green. And I'm always looking back and forth at the apple. Okay, so I've started with my lime green apple. I've gone back and I started with my yellow and then I added green on top to create the lime green color. And then I came back with some green. My brush was watery, and then added some darker areas on top of that lime green to kind of give the idea or feeling that there were darker areas. I also see on my apple that there are some little red spots. So I'm just gonna get a little bit of red on my brush and add that. If you have done what I just did and you're like, whoa, that is way too much, just wash your brush, come back around it. And we're just gonna blot it a little bit. To make the red less vibrant. More of what we might have seen on that part of the apple. Okay, I'm gonna leave this part to dry and I'm gonna move on to this apple. And this is a variegated, it's got the yellow undertones and then reds on top. So we are going to start with the yellow. Notice that my watercolors are not mixed. That's going to be really hard for the little ones who are doing this. Older students who have worked with watercolor, you know that you need to, unless you have your personal palette where you can mix, you know that you need to wash your brush in between to not pollute the color. I've also taught you how to clean those colors with a clean paper towel, how to blot if you do pollute your color. So make sure you're trying to keep the colors that you're working with clean as you go. And you're just moving your brush around the areas that you've drawn. I have my yellow base, and so now I'm going to come back with my red, and with watercolor wet on wet, this is a cold press paper. You can see that it's holding the watercolor pretty well, even in the layers that I've been doing. And so, but when you are adding wet color on top of wet color, it's going to blend or come together. So that's just something that you need to know and be ready for. We are not trying with watercolor to get every single little striation of this red. We're giving an idea. We're giving an idea that there is red on this particular type of apple. And I'm moving with my red out and from the middle out, because whenever I look at my red, that's what I see these color striations doing. So I'm doing the same thing with my brush, moving it out. If you are more interested in getting it exactly the way that you see it and you want those lines to show, then you can let the yellow dry first and then come back. And you can always add and get a little more detailed later on. you can also see how letting your colors not come together, what that's going to end up looking like. Using your brush, you can guide where some of your color is headed. Okay, now I'm going to move on to my ruby red. The ruby red is mostly darker tones. There is a lighter area. And so we're just going to play with the red layering. And when you're using a very kind of primary paint palette, then ways of creating dimension or color value would be layering on top, so the color being layered on top of itself to create that depth and that value. So that's what we're going to do with this red. Still going slowly around my stem. And now coming back, I didn't dip into the water this time, but coming back on top of what I've already painted with only red. And getting that darker. Okay, and then moving on to this yellow. It is not a perfect yellow. If you were to get it close to the lime green, the Granny Smith, you would see that it's got some green in it. So we're going to use that. We're going to start with our yellow base, bright yellow. And then we will come back with just a little bit of green. I'm going to have my brush pretty watery as I come over to my green. I'm just going to pick up a little bit. When you're finished with your apples, make sure you wash your brush, bring it to a nice point, and then move it over to the side or leave it where it is. Let it dry, and then we will come back in just a little bit once our apples are dry, and we will continue. So we have let our apples dry, and we are going to focus on the bird's eye view of the plate. Maybe you have a plate that you really that you're using at your house and you really want to try to paint that. I'm using this silver charger, and there's really no silver that I have today for watercolor, so I'm going to give kind of an idea of the color beneath the apples. I'm going to use a little bit of my black, and then I'm going to use some of my liquid watercolor for an aqua blue kind of idea. So using just a little bit of black on my brush, I'm going to create a kind of gray background, and the amount of water on your brush compared to the amount of black that you dip will depend on what is coming off of your brush. And as I'm starting, you can see the color, the value difference. That I'm starting with. I'm going to keep my brush pretty watery. Maybe you're like, oh, I do not want a gray background for mine, which is fine. You could explore a little bit with your watercolor and try melting some of your colors together. And notice that if I have a color that I'm just continuing it on, it's on my brush, I'm continuing that. I'm working in small sections. And if I have a darker area like this, I'm just going to move that color around. Carefully going around. Every time I dip in my black, I'm dipping in my water first. That's how I'm diluting that dark, concentrated color. And if I want just a little bit of black and I'm wanting it more of a very light kind of dove gray like I started with here, then my brush is very wet and I just barely touched my black pigment. This is not a good time if you have a lot going on in your day. This is not a good time to paint a portion and then leave and think that you're going to come back. This part, when you're working with a color like we just did, you really need to do this all in one sitting to let the variations of your value mold together, come together. Okay, so now I'm going to come around the rim. Remember, my rim is not one-to-one or realistic to the charger I was using. I was just using that as an idea to start with. So the value on the outside rim, I'm going to make a little bit darker so that you can see the difference between those edges. If you have an area that you feel is too dark, then you just move the color down where you think it needs to be. So now I have my charger. I'm looking down at that. And now I'm going to come back and add, maybe, I still have some watery black on my brush. And now I'm just going to come back and add some darker areas. To that charger. And then I noticed that whenever I was looking down originally on my piece, that I saw the shadows, and this isn't really, we're not going heavy this week into value or shadow or highlight. We're just really having fun with watercolor. But I'm gonna add some of that kind of idea, shadow, to my charger using a aqua blue. Now that I'm finished with the undercolor of my charger, I'm going to come back on top. Okay, we're going to let this sit aside for just a little bit. We're going to let our plate or charger background dry, and then we will come back and finish our pattern parts. Make sure that you are rinsing your brush and bringing it to a point, letting it dry.